Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about how to be a compassionate landlord. Now, this comes from an article I saw on Radio New Zealand. Minister of Housing, Megan Woods.
How do you see it on the radio?
No, they've got a great website, okay. Radio New Zealand, talking about the Minister of Housing would like to see landlords be a bit more compassionate in some areas. You know, saying, look, we meet some great landlords, but we think there could be some more compassion from some landlords. And so I had a thought about this. And I thought, well, let's talk about 6 ways to be a compassionate landlord, or what our definition of that is. You know, if you're going to be a solid, ethical landlord. And so we've got 6 things here. We'll go back and forth. But I think the thing that was really interesting was that the minister talked about that before people fall into transitional housing, so that's the need for motels in other words, people tend to be in the private rental market, or they tend to be living in private rental accommodation, and for whatever reason they fall out of that. I think that was the real trigger where they thought that there was need for perhaps some compassion. So we're going to go through this. Now, what I do want to say as well is that there are many things in that particular article that we would usually rip into and disagree with. But I thought, you know what, today, let's just focus on that compassionate part and the 6 things that we can all do in order to be compassionate. Start us off, Andrew.
So firstly, recognise that the property that you're renting out is the tenant's home. So yes, you own it and you absolutely have a sense of entitlement, but you don't want to take that so far that you're impeding on a tenant's ability to enjoy their home. So what I mean by that is you need to respect their privacy and respect that it is their home, and they're going to want to have it organised in their particular way. So I know when I started out as a landlord, if there was stuff on the floor, I'd probably get annoyed about that and you know, make a big deal of it. But at the end of the day, if it's not causing damage, it's probably not the end of the world. Similarly, you want to give them their privacy. So what that means is, and my dad did this with his first rental, don't drive past all the time and check the lawns, because if they see a 60-year-old man driving past, slowing down and looking into their windows, they might get a little bit concerned. So you want to respect that, yes, this is your house, but this is the tenant's home.
100%. It might be your house, but it's their home. Next one for me is increasing the rent by small amounts often. Now, you might say to me, Ed, how are you going to spin this into being compassionate? But the key thing that I would say is where you see a lot of landlords cop a lot of flack in the media is when there are periods of large rental increases. Now, legally, landlords are able to do that if they are catching up to the market rate. But what we often see is that landlords let this slide for a long time. They don't increase the rent. All of a sudden, maybe an interest rate changes, something happens in their personal situation, and the rent goes up by such an amount that the tenant's unable to cope with it. And I believe that increasing the rent by a small amount, you know, somewhere between 2 and 5%, depending on what the market's doing, is actually the most compassionate thing, because you're allowing that tenant to adjust their budgets, to adjust their spending, to account for that. And then what that means is that if they leave your property and need to move somewhere else, whether for work or they want a different place, they need more rooms, that they're actually at that market level all the time, that it's not going to be such a large increase for them. Now, of course, if you keep the rent low for some time, there is some benefit to the tenant and the fact that they don't have to pay that higher rent, but they really feel that pain when they eventually move on, or when you do decide to make a correction and increase that rent further. But that's where it really does hurt them, because that's where they have to make a real adjustment to their living standards or to their budgets. And I think that that's actually not a very compassionate thing to do. The key thing is to keep up with that rent, keep increasing it by small amounts over time.
Next one is using a property manager. So remember, a property manager is a great tool to use between you and the tenant so that they're dealing with a professional. Let's face it, if you're dealing with something yourself, you're probably going to be a little bit more emotive, and if it's not your full-time job, you're not going to be able to be as responsive to your tenants. So if you've got tenants who are at home during the day because they've got kids there potentially, or maybe they work night shift and something goes wrong and they call you and you're at work and can't deal with something, something, that becomes a real issue between you and the tenant. And I think one of the major problems with people that manage their own property is the deferred maintenance side of things. So if you can't keep on top of things and deal with issues straight away, it can really affect how they're living. The other part to that is, as Ed was talking before, keeping the rent in line with the market. So if you're using a professional property manager, they're going to be able to tell you and also the tenant what the actual market is doing right now. And again, with an unbiased view of making sure both sides are happy.
And I do think, just coming off that as well, I don't answer my phone at the best of times. If I find
Let
out,
alone an email.
But if I see the tenant's email at 7 p.m. at night, I'll be like, okay, I've got to organise that plumber now to go sort them out. But the businesses that might be able to fix that issue, a plumber or an electrician, they might not be answering their phones at that time. The main line's not being answered. And so it just causes issues and delays. Now, number 4 on my list of being a compassionate landlord definitely is around handling default payments. So payments that haven't been made. And this really speaks to what the minister was talking about in terms of looking for some compassion. Now, look, I am not talking about letting tenants get away with not paying. I think it's important that they meet their contractual obligations and the things that they've signed up to, and that we all do what we said we were going to do. But I do think that there sometimes needs to be a bit of flexibility in terms of if a tenant misses a payment because something extraordinary happened, their car broke down, something along these lines, we need to just think about, well, what support can we offer them? And certainly I think one thing we can do is let them know about these government schemes which have just been introduced. Perhaps we'll do a podcast on them. Now, again, I'm not expecting you to know this, but this is certainly something that a property manager would do, or that if you are a very active landlord renting out privately, that you are aware of support that is out there, so that if somebody doesn't make a rental payment, if they miss a rental payment, that they can access that government support. Because the sorts of people that sometimes miss these payments probably don't know that those are actually available. So I think being aware of the additional support that is out there is very important, so you can let the tenant know where they're able to go and access that support. Now, beyond that, of course, we need to follow up and make sure that we as property investors are being paid the things that people have told us they're going to pay. They've had the provision of the rental property. They need to pay for that. That's what the agreement is. But we also do need to acknowledge that, hey, some people need help and they may not know where to go in these instances.
Next one is product selection. So actually choosing a property that's appropriate for renting out. So making sure it's up to healthy home standard, or making sure that you get it up to healthy home standard before you're letting it out, making sure that you're not got things like worn carpet that someone could trip on, making sure that it's safe and healthy for your tenants. And also the other part to that might be diversifying in different types of products as well. You might buy some room by room rentals so that you can cater to more people, or you might add a minor dwelling on the back to get another person into a house, or give someone else an option, a larger family, someone that might not be able to rent the 3-bedroom house that's there already.
And the other reason why that is real compassion is that you're able to provide a product, a place to live at a much cheaper rate. That's why room by room rental landlords, in my view, are quite compassionate, because they are literally allowing people to have a place to call their own at a cheaper rate, and providing that is, in my view, a very ethical thing to do. Number 6 is giving people a go. So one of the people who were interviewed for this particular Radio New Zealand article that I've just mentioned were people who were looking at 7 properties per week, and they were being turned down time after time for a number of reasons. They'd still see that in some cases they'd applied for a place, been turned down, but the property a couple of weeks later is still out there available for rent. Now, I am not necessarily saying that this person absolutely should have had a home, because I don't know what's on their credit report. I don't know their previous payments records, whether they actually are paying rent. There could be a number of reasons why this person wasn't offered a property, and all of those would be perfectly legitimate. But I do think that part of being a compassionate landlord is to have some scope for giving people a go. So I remember when we had Linda on here, we were talking about going through somebody's credit report and saying, oh, they've been turned down by this. Looks like they missed a payment 3 months ago from their power company, whatever it happened to be. And actually saying at some point people don't need to have perfect credit records as long as they're upfront with you and explaining the fact that, hey, I was going through a really rough time then 11 months ago. You'll see that I've missed some payments. It's because I was made redundant during COVID. Now I'm in a better position. I've got a full-time job. You know, things are looking up. But hey, look, those are on my credit report. Those happened. I accept that and I'm looking forward to moving forward and I've paid those back. You know, those sorts of things I think definitely give that sort of person a go, because bad stuff does happen. You don't have to have a perfect credit report, but hey, if somebody's committed to doing what they're saying they're going to do, and this is what it all comes down to, then that's the area where there may be some scope for leeway.
Actually, probably that's quite similar to, so my sister, the oldest of the two sisters, is a solo mother of two, and she is probably, you know, on paper, not the ideal tenant because potentially, you know, she's reliant on one income. She would never miss a rental payment because she's so reliant on wanting to retain that home that she doesn't want to have her family uplifted. So she's far more diligent than maybe my other sister, the younger one, who has only got herself to worry about.
So I think these are very important ways to kind of in some instances go beyond the legal minimums. And but having said that, I do think that it's very important that we always follow legal processes, even if we don't think that in some cases they may be the most compassionate thing. Because what I've kind of found from my experience is that if you are a landlord or a property investor and you don't follow the legal processes, if you're in some cases too nice, if I can say that, then that is where you may get burnt from a tenant because you've been so nice and then somebody's taken advantage of that. Because the investors that tend to get the most flack in the media are the ones that have been burnt. They've become battle hardened in some ways and have lost some of that compassion that they had at the start. So if you in some ways protect yourself, that means that you're going to be in the position to be able to follow these 6 things that we've talked about, to give people the benefit out of the doubt in many ways.
And because, again, going back to the fact that this is a tenant's home, you know, people are protective of their home, whether or not they own it or otherwise. And there's nothing wrong with being a tenant and renting a property. But being a landlord, you have this responsibility to make it comfortable for your tenants and make sure that their needs are met. Otherwise you shouldn't be in the game.
And certainly when I'm thinking about this idea of compassion, there are 3 lenses that you've got to weigh up when you're making these sorts of decisions. First of all, your decisions have to make economic sense for you. So I'm not telling you to go and rent out your property for $100 a week when it's really worth $500 a week, because that probably wouldn't make economic sense for you and your family. For this sort of compassion that we're talking about to be sustainable, it has to be somewhat profitable. It has to be attractive enough that investors are out of the market and that we're willing to rent out our properties because it makes economic sense for us. That's the bottom line. We've also got to follow our legal responsibilities as landlords and investors. So we've got to meet healthy homes. We've got to follow the tenancy regulations out there, because that's what our society, for better or worse, has decided that's what we want. Those are our legal minimums. But you also want to view it through this final lens, which is that ethical lens as well, that compassionate lens, and say, hey, are there some times where I can go through a little bit further? And I am talking about specifically when you're giving people the benefit of the doubt, when you're saying, hey, look, you're going through a rough time. Here's where you can access additional support. That's going to be a bit beyond and kind of giving them the helping hand that sometimes tenants need.
Or the COVID situation.
COVID, you sound like such an old man.
It's
the COVID.
The COVID situation. I remember it was only about 14 months ago, getting those phone calls from a lot of my investors who wanted to know what our position was on helping out tenants. And it was always, hey, if you can afford to do that, absolutely offer some support if your tenants need it, because a little bit of compassion goes a long way to loyalty. Your tenants are far more likely to look after your house long term if you've given them a break at some stage.
Certainly one thing you could use is we always budget for 3 weeks worth of vacancy a year. So if somebody falls behind and you either decide to, hey, look, we'll give you that week for free, or offer some sort of payment plan, something along those lines, whatever is doable for you in your situation, then that can sometimes be very, very useful because you can give up one of your weeks of vacancy today in order not to have 3 weeks of vacancy or 4 weeks of vacancy when you have to go back out to market and find a tenant later on. Now, you're going to have to make that decision for yourself. whether you think that sort of loyalty is going to be rewarded by your particular tenant, whether you've got that good relationship, whether you want to keep them. But these are 6 things you can do in order to be that compassionate landlord. Recognising that it is the tenant's home, might be your house, but it's their home, using the property manager, making small rental increases often, managing those default payments, choosing the right property to rent out in the first place, and also giving people a go. And I think those are probably 6 things that hopefully Minister Megan Woods would be very happy to hear.
And will get us into heaven.
I certainly hope so. And one thing I should say is that
I don't know if I could handle eternity with you, mate. I'll take the other side.
You can barely handle 15 minutes a day. Now, we have invited the minister on the show, and I'm hoping that if I badger her staff enough, that they will let me on. So
we'll send her the podcast. And all of you could just send her an email, coffeeandpodcast@opuspartners.co.nz, say that you'd love to hear her on the show.
Because, well, I'm pursuing this. I really wanted to come on and talk about this, and say, well, is this what you're talking about? What else would you like to add into it? And I know that a lot of people listening to the show really would be interested to hear what she's got to say. Look, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. One thing I want to mention as well, we are doing our cash flow hacking reviews. So the cash flow hacking idea or concept that we've introduced over the last 2 months has been incredibly popular, and people have been asking, look, could I sit down with Ilse to review my portfolio, specifically looking at what are the ways that you listening to the show, that I are able to increase the rent on my portfolio. Now, I'm going to drop a link to where you can sign up for one of those. I think it's $250 plus GST in order to sit down with Ilse for an hour in order to be able to come up with some practical ideas that you can actually use to increase that rent. So I'm going to drop a link to where you can sign up for that in the show notes, or just tap or swipe over the cover art. You'll find the link in there. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
I'm going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.